All right, we are live. Coach Talk number 3 at CRI. Institute for Rowing Leadership. We got Coach Bodie throwing it down today with some rigging and rowing musings. We'll recap on his joy of sculling and what he's learned over the past couple of weeks. So should be a ton of fun.
The boys go to Clemson, and the girls end up going.
You guys work for Coach.
Don't expect me to. None on my phone. Wait. No, none on my phone right now. I might have downloaded this, but I think I downloaded a bunch of stuff the first 2 days to try.
All right, we're back. Bodie's getting fired up here.
Oh boy.
Sam's ready.
Crazy.
CRI Coach Talk 3. Now, the beauty of this, guys, is, we'll see what happens tonight. But you guys can find this video in the CRI blog.
Okay.
Coach Education blog. So if you want to look back at anything we covered tonight.
Good to see you.
Really good.
Nice.
So welcome, everyone.
Yes,
looks like
thanks,
you guys
Pat.
all dug in. Please continue to dig in. I
Prepared.
may have made a huge mistake.
No.
I was like, how many ounces of meat can each person eat? And how many people are RSVP'd? And I never want to have like too little food. So we have plenty of sloppy joes over there. My first stab at making sloppy joes in probably like 10, 15 years. I'm really excited about it. Hopefully it's delicious. So help yourself. Please dig in. We got pretzels and chips kind of around the tables for people to pass. Also, feel free to get up and move. Don't feel like you're glued.
Maybe we'll do some
Plenty of beverages in the cooler. Help yourself.
Eat the sloppy joes and then get a jump.
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah. Really pumped to have you guys. Tom Stahl, who's been helping me sort of facilitate these, he's on his way down to Sarasota with Harvard. So good to be here tonight, but I'm gonna be here to sort of lend my hands facilitating. But I feel like you guys have probably the expert, the one person at CRI who's probably been to and been a part of all of the CRI Coach Talks and roundtables. So
That's probably true.
you're in good hands with Coach Bodie here. And for those that just came in, help yourselves. We got plenty of room, plenty of beer, plenty of food. We got sloppy joes, pretzel chips. Please dig in and help yourselves and don't feel like you have to be glued in one spot.
Excellent.
So, without further ado, I'll let Bodie take over.
I guess. Yeah. Hi. How are you guys? Do you want to hear?
Good. Come on. There we go. We're awesome.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Pat.
And is everyone okay with a pup?
Yes.
Is anyone allergic to dogs or anything? No. Alright, just checking. I'm gonna go grab my puppy. His name is Fergus. You want,
Yes,
you
we
want
got
like
Fergus.
a lap warmer, you want some puppy time.
How about feeding?
Well, try not to, I already cooked it. So try not to drop
Just
it.
checking.
Nice. Well, thanks everybody for coming. I guess what I'm gonna the gist of what's going on here is that at CRI we are very grateful that we can get the opportunity to go and take some workshops and continuing education stuff, and so as part of that, it's really neat that we can sort of come back home and sort of share that information or share some of the things that we may have learned with the rowing community here on the East Coast or in the Northeast, which is kind of fun. So last December we went, a number of us went to the Jim Joy Sculling Conference and had 2 days of sort of like workshops and sort of attending different things, and I've been doing that now for probably about, I don't know, maybe about 3 years or so, going to Jim Joy, and it was really great. A lot of the presenters are fantastic, and I also just recently came back from the junior conference too this past weekend, and also had some really cool presenters. I'd never seen Chris Korzanowski before, so he was kind of neat just to just to listen to him for a little while. It was kind of cool. But when I went to Jim Joy back in December, I had been very familiar with this little book on rigging, and of course maybe some of you guys know there's also the Davenport book, and that's a slightly different book that also has some really cool sort of the nuts and bolts of rigging is sort of the guide. That's the older sort of version. But anyway, I had been familiar with this book, and I'd seen it around. I poked at it for a little while, and I finally actually had the chance to sit in with Mike Purser and realize that he's actually really funny. He was a really, really funny guy. He gave a really great presentation. I can see why so many people like him, because he's a really, really great guy. So all of this stuff that's like essentially what he's talking about, or what I'll be talking about, is just sort of located in here as well. Although more recently, the little video clips that I'll show you, I believe he's at a point in his career where he's really starting to launch himself as a consultant of rigging in many different ways. And he started his own website, which I've kind of sort of picked up on, and he's just doing some really cool things. So, so hopefully we'll get a chance to take a look at some of those items. But so my job will sort of be at least just to set up some discussion. We have some sort of case scenarios that we can take a look at, while we're going through this. But what I'm really hoping to sort of get out is sort of turning your gears and getting your brain sort of thinking a little bit about like the differences in the way people, the anatomy of a person. Kind, could you stand up, kind? So if myself and Kynan had to row in a boat, or something like that, it would be a little bit of a challenge if we rowed in a pair, obviously, to sort of get the thing to go straight. Thank you, Kynan. And so, so I think one of the things that comes up when we sort of think about rigging, there's a lot of different issues that start to come up that I hope we'll sort of discuss as part of our scenarios, like what things that we sort of have to manage in our own rowing programs in terms of like who uses the equipment, what equipment is there, are there do we use different pieces of equipment, like do I have a Resolute for a 4 and a Vesfoli for an 8, and there's just some different things. We won't get too mired down in some of those items, but I guess before I start, I'd like to hear a little bit about what groups of people do you mostly coach? So I'm going to start off with Kynan.
Okay. Hi, my name is Kynan Rielich, and I'm largely coaching intermediate girls here at CRI.
Okay, and what is an intermediate girl? Or how
Sorry.
old are they, or big are they?
Middle school, junior high school level girls.
Level of skill?
Just not quite
above,
novices.
Above learn to row?
Above learn to row. Perfect.
Thank you, Kynan.
Alyssa Pomfrey, I coach varsity high school girls.
Okay.
At Arlington Belmont.
Okay, cool. Awesome.
And I'm Mary Kay Kenny, and I coach novices at Cambridge Richard Latin School, novice high school.
Okay, novice high school. Boys and girls?
I am supposed to be girls, but I end up helping with boys too.
Got it. Okay.
My name is Mike Harrington. I coach the high school boys at Middlesex School, ranging from kids who have never touched an oar before to kids who have rowed for 5, 6 years.
Okay.
Patrick. Pat, I am the director of coaching education here at the Boathouse, running the Super Rowing Leadership. So if anyone's interested in joining us at the IRL, they'll talk with you. We also have the What Works Summit coming up. I'm helping out with the Radcliffe Lightweight Women, doing some strength training with them.
I didn't know that.
What's up?
Andy O'Brien, Arlington Belmont crew, right now I think it's varsity boys.
Okay, cool.
Tori, CRI Novice Girls, so I've got a mix of 8th through 10th graders primarily, and then a couple juniors sprinkled in there.
In the back, yeah.
Karen Borazzo, I'm not currently coaching.
You could, yes, as yourself. I was gonna say you could either
Myself
what you row as well, if you row in a single or a double or okay.
and a double.
Great. Okay. Awesome.
Charlie Weems, I'm the director of rowing at Burke Academy. I also am the head coach of the boys varsity.
Okay.
And basically, along with a colleague, we're the riggers for boys and girls, novices, or as we want to call them now, the development group, and then the varsity. And so we have everything from kids that are 6'5",
Yep.
seniors, to someone who hopefully will be 6'5".
That's good. Thank you.
Brian Tough Swimming.
Right. Excellent.
Claire Barkin, BC Open Women, and CRI Master Women.
Sam Ames. I coach mostly novices, either middle school age or high school, boys and girls, at CRI and BB&M.
Okay.
I'm John. I coach our national team aspirants and returning athletes, the para group, going to Worlds, going to the Olympics. And I'm also on the small boat committee down at Riverside, so rigging is very much of interest to me.
Ah, nice. Thank you. Cool. And I'm Bodie. Been around CRI for a little while. I'm starting to dig in a little bit more into the shop sort of work over the winter time. But I too, like Tori, usually work with novices and work with intermediate, sort of like less skilled folks. And so some of this stuff that we're going to sort of go through might be a little bit less applicable to individual rigging. Like you probably wouldn't want to start doing that with people that are not showing consistent rowing strokes. You just want to make sure that all the stuff doesn't fall off the boat and make sure that the boat is square, right? I mean, those are some of the things that we would do for less skilled athletes, because the greater variable is obviously the athlete, right? And then there comes a point where you can start, as long as the person is starting to display some consistency, you can start to work around some of those things by making some slight adjustments, okay? So, cool. Well, thanks for letting me know where you guys are at. I think we'll slide over to, so again, this is really my takeaway of what we learned from Mike. And, you know, it's always important, I think, for myself to, and I think just in general, is to, you know, there's definitely never a silver bullet, right? And the other thing that I try to remember is, like, let's get back to the basics. I used to work in the automotive industry a little bit, and sometimes we would send a car out on the track, and one of the things that we got really good at, or at least one of the things that I learned from being in that environment all the time, is that you only want to make, you know, one change at one time. You know, you don't want to sort of get yourself lost in moving one thing and then changing the height of this other thing, or changing the spread and changing the oar, because you really sort of start getting yourself into, you know, what would happen in the car is that the driver would go out and they'd report some feedback, and then they'd come back in and we'd make some changes, and then you'd get, you know, 45 minutes later, you'd make 3 or 4 different changes, and you'd come right back to that same spot that you were in before. So it's like the car was completely different, but yet the driver was experiencing the same sorts of feedback, right? So, so case in point is that we would just make one change at a time if we were going to make any changes, just to sort of see if we can get that. But anyway, so what is actually rigging? Or we're just going to go through the quick outline here. So we're going to just define what Mike says that is. We'll go through some discussion questions. We'll talk about what can actually be adjusted. We'll take a look at when we might move something, or when we should not maybe move something. Then I'm going to give you guys a little bit of visual aid using not only an exercise for yourselves in this room, but we're also going to take a look at just the basic squat. And hopefully by looking at this little apparatus that that Tom Purvis has designed, you guys can really see just how different our bodies are. And then we'll sort of take a look at some rigging scenarios. We also have some of Mike Purser's videos too, which I think you'll find really fascinating, because he's really, he uses, is anyone familiar with, what are some of the software or apps that you guys use when you're videotaping your athletes? Does anyone use any? Go ahead. Coach's Eye. Coach's Eye.
We
Okay.
use Huddle technique.
Huddle. Okay, I've heard of that. I think Mike mentions that. Yeah. Okay. There's also another one called Dartfish. It's a PC-based program. It's a little bit more in-depth. It's not an app, I don't think, per se, but Mike uses that to. One of the things that's really cool about the Dartfish app is that you can actually set distance standards on the video, and then you can actually measure things in that video without actually, right? You can sort of like measure them and know what you're looking at, and be able to do that right from the video. You don't actually have to measure it in real life, right? It's kind of a cool little item.
What is it called?
It's called Dartfish.
Dartfish.
Dartfish, yes. And you'll see it on the bottom of his stuff.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay, huh.
Yeah. So yeah. Yeah. So then let's see. Let's see what we got here. So he says, and I think this is kind of a really cool thing. So the presentation that I attended was about individual rigging, right? But I think in looking at the ways in which you can move individual components around for an individual athlete, it's also a really cool way of starting to learn what you're doing when you're moving all of the. If you have to move all 4, you move all 4. It's very, very similar. But the idea here is individual rigging is the process of adjusting the boat, the rigger, and the oar for each athlete to provide comfort, to compensate for physical differences amongst athletes that might be in the same crew, and to allow the crew to row with similar or outboard angles and good timing at the catch and the release. So this part is the really important part of the presentation if you're dealing with less skilled athletes, is improving the athlete's rowing technique is always preferred to individual rigging. Okay? So that's kind of number one. So if you're working with athletes like myself as the novices, the only time I ever make specific allowances for one athlete in some cases is if they're an extreme outlier, right? If I have a full boat of people who are around 5'6" and they're all kind of rowing similarly, and I have this one gal who's 6'1", and she's so lanky and she just sprouted up 7 inches over in 1 year, like I may make an adjustment for that because that person is just so outside the sort of like norm of all the other sort of athletes that are in that boat. So that's kind of when I would do that. But for the most part, if you're working with incoming athletes that are learning a lot, you just want to work on that for sure. And so some of the things that, like we kind of took a look at were, why do we actually do the rigging thing? Like obviously we have, oars is the easiest one to think about when it comes to sort of like what gear, what sort of thing do I need to, what kind of a load are the athletes experiencing and can they manage that load? And can they do it at race cadence, right? And the oar is essentially like a huge lever, and that's the way we would sort of modify your gear to the greatest degree is just by adjusting the oar. So this is something that sometimes happens, like why not just set the boat one way and force the athletes to row that way? Another example from the race car stuff that I'd like to share is that oftentimes engineers can make a car do things that human beings are unable to manage. In other words, in theory, if a driver could handle 6 Gs on a particular corner or something like that, the car would be quicker if you just made it this way by the numbers. But in reality, there's a human being that's involved in the process of sort of like making a car, or in this case, making a boat go fast. So that's why comfort is a significantly important issue when it comes to sort of making sure that the rig is good for people, right? If the athlete's not comfortable, let's say, for example, when I was young and I started messing around with some of this stuff, one day I decided I was going to put a 117 inboard because I wanted to get a lot of leverage. I wanted to give them a lot of leverage. And then, 117 on the inboard puts the oar out here somewhere, right? And I'm like, why do they look like they're all leaning away from their rigger? Well, duh, because you gave an extra 3 centimeters of length to this side of the oar handle, and that puts their bodies over here, right? I'm thinking, in theory, it made sense. I'm going to give them more leverage, but it made it so uncomfortable that they couldn't row, right? So that's sometimes like some of the stuff that I have learned a little bit from. What are the items that we can change? Like, what are the adjustments we can make? What things can we actually improve in or not improve with rigging? For example, one of the things that you can improve would be like a person's dorsiflexion. Like, there's only so much that you can do, right? Like, if you could make adjustments by lowering or raising the heel cup of an athlete's foot, but you can't change. Like, if they come to a hard stop and that's what they have, then that's where you'd want to move the boat. But if they can improve their flexibility, then you would want to keep helping them improve their flexibility, right? What kind of athletes? This is a big one, right? Right? What do the athletes actually need, right? Rather than sort of like, oh, you know what? I found out that Stanford is using, they're doing 378 with a 113.5. Like that's what we're going to do to go fast. Like that doesn't make any sense if you're not working with those level of athletes or different athletes, right? So just because Harvard does it doesn't mean that we should all try to do it, right? We've got to figure out what works for our crews. What are some of the issues that make rigging out your rowing program difficult or easy? Does anyone have a full-time rigging person? No. Okay. That's good. I'm glad you laughed. That's good. Some did. We have someone. Well, we have what's Rick from Northeastern come in and chatting it up in the mornings. And then, how do you know that the rigging that you've chosen is optimal for that crew? In your athletes. How do you know? How do you test it? Right. So hopefully we'll be able to sort of like take a look or chat a little bit more about those kinds of things. So here's the thing we're going to do. I'm going to sort of watch a little bit of a video first, just to sort of get your gears turning about this. And I'm hoping. Let's see here. I'm not a super techie guy, so let's see. I can at least get to. So here's Mike's. his little perseverance website. That's his book, obviously. He's got a bunch of videos up here that you guys can all look at, drive time, stroke position. But I'm going to show you the stroke position, because stroke position, essentially, like when we get kids to sit into a boat, it's the number one thing that we do when the kid sits in the boat. Okay, how long are your legs-ish? Right, you sit in the boat, you go to the finish. Okay, you set your foot plate in this particular place based on the fact that you're like, oh, are your wheels hitting the backstops? No? Okay, you're good? Right, like where does that? And so the stroke position is determined by where you move that foot plate. Okay, and so I'll just let him take it away here. Let's see if we can, oh, what about?
And today, we're going to have a look at what I think is one of the most important dimensions of rigging.
Yeah, I think it's on the TV.
Yeah.
Typically let their athletes train every time they get in the boat. Did you guess footstops? And when the athlete moves the footstops, the dimension that changes is the stroke position.
Right.
This video will discuss Hugh's mention of stroke position and how we measure it. Stroke position is the location of the stroke arc relative to the boat. It is often measured in degrees of oar catch angle, finish angle, and total arc. This graphic shows how the dimension of catch length controls the stroke position, and coaches often use marks or straws on the gunnels and have athletes move their footstops accordingly to set the oar catch angle. Another quick and easy way to assess the stroke position is a measurement by time. The time the oar is in the water from catch to perpendicular of the boat relative to the entire stroke. This comparison gives us a percentage of the stroke before the oar reaches perpendicular. The first step to measuring stroke position is to capture video of the athlete rowing past a stationary camera or smartphone at race rate and race intensity. Similar to previous rigging analysis videos, you must use a playback software with a frame timer that displays the time in hundredths or thousandths of a second. To measure the stroke position, identify the frame time at the catch when the blade is fully buried. Here, we see the catch fully buried at 1.351 seconds.
It's a sculler moving in that direction.
Record the time and forward the video to the frame where the oar is perpendicular to the boat. Large crews with multiple oars may be challenging, and it's best to look for the frame where most of the oars are perpendicular. The time for perpendicular here appears to be 1.785 seconds. For the time, and next, identify the finish position frame. Here we see the blade is in its most sternward position at 2.068 seconds, when the blade is most sternward and the athlete's hands have stopped moving towards the body. Now that we have the times for catch, perpendicular, and finish, we can calculate the stroke position. This slide shows the formula to calculate stroke position. It is the percentage of time from the catch to perpendicular relative to the entire stroke. Here we see that this athlete has a stroke position of 60.5%. This stroke position measurement is quick and easy and provides coaches an insight to their rigging analysis. As noted at the start of this video, stroke position is a critical dimension of rigging. It is a factor that affects both blade slip and drive time. I've measured the top 12 finishers at the World Championships in the 10 singles categories, senior, under 23, and junior, including lightweights, for both men and women. The data shows the average stroke position for all singles categories combined is 66%. This varies slightly with categories, but generally 2/3 of the sculling stroke should be before the pin. With this information, coaches can adjust the footstops and change the stroke position.
Does that make sense? Okay, so that he's saying that approximately, right, 2/3 of the rowing stroke should be completed by perpendicular to the boat, right? So if you're setting up your foot plate, I mean, obviously the first thing that you're going to do is try to make sure that the athlete is comfortable, that they don't have the thing like way out here, or that they're not rowing it like here, right? But then to be more specific about making sure that the work itself is getting done, that all of that work is probably supposed to be done before you actually get to the pin. Yeah.
It seems to me, especially probably the last 15 years in international rowing, that the seats are going well beyond the pin. I guess, which is indicating that then they're bringing their oar
Yeah.
quite a bit to bow.
Very far, right. And then the idea of sort of pinching the boat, right?
Yeah.
Right. So there's a couple of things. I tell you what. How about we watch a quick another one? This is kind of like we'll just let it free flow for a little bit. I'll let you guys. The other one that we can do is we can do blade slip. Okay, because like the thing that I want to I'm gonna have kind of stand up again for me. Kind of, can you stand? And I try to do this with the girls a lot too. Okay, so let's see here. Yeah, I'll put you right. You gonna? Okay, right there. Here, right here. There it is. Good. Okay. Let's just say. So this is how I try to explain to the girls. Like this is how you move the boat, because they think that they. Thank you, Kynan, for being. Okay. So. Right. So a lot of times, like people just have this understanding that I put the oar in the water and I pull the oar through the water. Right. Like I'm actually moving the blade through the water, and of course that's not. We all mostly know that that's not what's happening. I try to say to them, just imagine that there's a telephone pole in the river. Somehow, someone just jammed a telephone pole into the river, and you're rowing by, and as you're rowing by, you're taking your oar, you're putting it in the water, you're pushing the boat, and the thing passes, and then you take your oar and you put your blade right in front of that telephone pole, and you move the entire boat and crew past the telephone pole. And like, see? You make a really good telephone pole. Thanks, man. Yeah. Okay. So does that make sense, right?
Mike Sprague uses that analogy. He says, imagine there's a peg in the water and you're reaching for the peg and you don't want any slippage. You want to grab it and take advantage.
Yeah. Yeah, right. Yeah, you're kind of like putting it's like a hard, or you're trying to make it as hard a stop as possible so that you're moving the entire rowing system past that spot. So let's see if we can take a look at the next one. He might have it in. It should say drive time blade slip. So here's another way in which he measures things.
Hello again, Mike Purser here, and today we want to have a quick look at other ways we evaluate your crew's rigging. This video will demonstrate how we measure the dimension of blade slip. Blade slip is a measurement of the distance that the tip of the blade moves in the water during the dry phase of the stroke, measured parallel to the boat. These graphics show the blade moves in the water from catch to finish. When a blade moves through the water, as on the left side of the screen, it is referred to as negative slip. On the right side, we see the blade has moved in the same direction as the boat, and this is referred to as positive slip. The first step in measuring blade slip is to video the crew. The camera or cell phone must be set stationary, aimed perpendicular to the path of the boat, and the crew should be rowing past at race rate and race intensity. This slide shows the setup of the camera and shell. The blade entry and exit from the water should be near the middle of the video frame to minimize the parallax error. Once the video has been captured, we can use video analysis software such as Canovia, Huddle Technique, Coach's Eye, or any program that allows you to draw on the video to identify the entry and exit points of the blade. Huddle and Coach's Eye are apps that can be loaded on your smartphone or tablet, which allows this process to be quick and easy. We are looking at this video with the Dartfish video analysis software to demonstrate how to measure blade slip. Using Dartfish, we can set a reference dimension to the video, as we know the width of the blade is 22 centimeters. The next step is to identify the point where the tip of the blade is fully buried in the water and draw a line on that point. We can move the video forwards and backwards to ensure we have the right location. Next, we identify the point where the tip of the blade is at the finish.
Pretty cool.
Again, we draw a line on the tip of the blade. Finally, using Dartfish, we can measure the distance that the tip of the blade has moved in the water. Here we see the blade slip is 20 centimeters, 0.20 meters in the negative direction. If you were using software without a measuring tool, estimate the distance between the two lines by comparing it with the blade width. Next, we will have a look at positive blade slip. Again, we use the blade as a reference dimension, identify the point of entry, confirm the point, identify the point of exit, the tip of the blade at the exit, and measure the distance. Here we see the blade has moved 0.29 meters, 29 centimeters in the positive direction. Positive blade slip is typically only found in sculling, and with proper rigging, you should be able to have a minimum of 15 centimeters of positive blade slip. Sweep rowing almost always results in negative blade slip, and anything better than negative 20 to negative 30 centimeters reflects good rigging. Remember, blade slip is only one factor of rigging analysis and must be used in conjunction with drive time analysis to fully evaluate the crew's rigging. If you thought this video was useful, please like it below and visit my Rowing Perseverance Facebook page for more coaching development tips.
There you go. So that's just another way in which, like, he's attempting to measure the factors that are contributing to the rig, right? And because he's collected so much data over the last 10 to 12 years, that he's able to compare all that data to what the fastest crews are doing and saying, like, okay, well, we know that blade slip on these crews are, you know, somewhere between this, and so you're aiming for that, right? And again, you know, obviously the two crews that you just looked at, or the two kinds of blades that we're looking at, are like very, very high level athletes at the World Championships, right? So, you know, for the most part, those guys are, they make less mistakes, and their rowing is very, very consistent, right? So that's why you can sort of measure that stuff with some pretty consistent, some confidence in the stuff. So okay, so what is it then that we could actually adjust? Oh, let's see here, what can we actually adjust? Let's see if we can get that, here we go. Right, so the things that we would adjust immediately would be our foot stops, right? So the sort of fore and aft position, which is also a comfort issue, as well as and I guess coaches also have to choose, do they want to sort of, do they want to actually sort of like have their rhythm surrounded by making sure that the catch angle or catch length is what they want, or do they want to sort of work with the finish angle or the finish length? Like, where is it that you want to sort of get that information, and how is it that you want to use that? So that's up to you guys, but the same factors are contributing to that. The height of the shoes, right? A lot of times, how many people work with novice boys? Yeah, right. And so, and you guys are very familiar with this, right? So if I sort of draw it on the board, you guys know what I'm talking about, I'm sure, right? So, right, you've got this, you've got sort of like the deck, and the seat is up here, right? Well, I guess I'll move that. That's kind of silly. So there you go. And then you have your foot plate, you know, sort of over here, right? And then, yeah, so if you have the athlete, there's the hips, there's that. I don't know if I'm going to get this right. Oh, there we go. Okay. Oh, this is, yeah, okay, cool. So there we go, right? And so oftentimes what happens to boys when they're growing really, really fast, like 6 inches in a year, right? Which is fast. Is potentially their kneecaps end up sort of like over here at the catch, right? As a result of having super, super long legs or what have you. And so if you move the foot or the heel up, right, that's going to obviously increase the horizontal nature of the force. If you move the heel down, like way down here, right, I guess the big thing for me is it always makes it more possible for people to have better forward reach or hip pivot if the heel is a little bit lower, right? And I think that's what's hard for boys, because sometimes they kind of get to this position and they can't really reach that far forward. So oftentimes they don't even have forward body prep. They just kind of like, because they just can't reach far enough forward. So in that case, I would definitely lower the heel if I could. So there's the height of that, right? The height of that. The other thing that we had was the angle, right? And so I think Mike talks about the different angles. That'll come up in the next little clip that I show you guys. But certainly, how many people share equipment with other, like, I know at CRI that our girls team shares with the women's team, right? And so sometimes we'll get into a boat, and it was rode at 5 o'clock in the morning, and then in the afternoon at 4 o'clock or 4:30, you know, you end up, you know, getting to practice, and there's, you know, 2 or 3 of the foot plates are like, you know, one of them's like this, you know, and like a crazy angle, and then other people who have like poor flexion in the ankles, sometimes it really has to do with just people adjusting stuff and not realizing that they're adjusting it in a certain way. And then other times you'll get into a boat and that angle of the foot plate will be like this, and it's like you're just, every time you take a stroke, you know, you're shoving your toes into the front of the shoe because it's like you're pointing your toe at the catch, right? So, but there is that sort of, what was it, 42-ish degree sort of angle that they talk about as being somewhere in the optimal spot. But just know that those things can be moved. The other thing that we don't really move a lot anymore is display, which is sort of like that width or sort of rotation of the feet. I know in the Hudsons we don't really have the ability to do that. The foot plates are bat logic and they just like bam, right? They're just sort of there. So those are the things you can change. Obviously you can change the oarlock height, right? We can change the spread or the span. The other thing I wanted to talk a little bit about here is the pitch, right, of the oarlock itself. About 3 years ago, I think it was, 3 or 4 years ago, we started to find that I row the Vespolis, they're like a big training sort of boat, but we started to realize that oftentimes I'd go out and I'd look at a crew and I'd watch them row, and when the blade was sort of like, so when they were putting the blade through the water on the drive, it was like this, and then of course when this is where sometimes you'll see that if kids are catching crabs very frequently, because they have a tendency to flick the oar handle at the finish and dump it, and what will happen is sometimes they over feather the blade, and for some reason I kept looking at blades on the feather, right, if the boat's heading in this direction, right, and the back edge of the blade was lower, right, than, the front edge of the blade, the top of the blade on the feather was actually lower than the bottom of the blade. I'm like, why does it look like the blade is actually like, you know, going this way, right? And so kids would catch crabs because we started to realize that there was something wrong, and I kept going from 4 degrees of pitch to 5 to 6 to 7, and it got a little bit better and it got a little bit better. But what we realized was, and correct me if I'm wrong, Pat, you might remember this, maybe Carl figured it out, but the carbon fiber unwinds, right, on the Concept 2 oars, and therefore the green sleeve was unwinding. And when the green sleeve would unwind, it would cause, even though you had 4 plugs on your boat, the blade was actually like this, right? Because the sleeve would actually unwind on the shaft, right? You remember that?
We found that in Florida,
You
that the heat, the leaving oars out in the sun and the heat, like, caused that issue to come up far more frequently, I
Really?
think, than apparently up north.
Right.
So,
Wow.
yes.
Epoxy.
Yeah, it's just something that causes that sort of, because it's just a wound piece of carbon all the way up the shaft. But so we were able to re-sleeve some of those, but it took a little while for us to figure out why that was happening. I was like, what's going on with that? Like, no matter what we were doing. So that was just one thing I wanted to mention. And obviously your oars, you know, those are the big things in terms of changing the load or changing the gearing. And then you can change the athlete, right? Right. And so that's hard. How many people, because I know at CRI, that in the beginning, especially on the novice cruise, we do that often, you know, largely because when a person is learning how to get better at skill, some people can get better really quick, right? And, you know, others take a little bit more time. So there's always like a constant sort of rotation of athletes. How many people have a very small number of athletes? Yeah, that's right. Yeah, so you don't have the ability to be like, hey, I'm going to just substitute another person in this seat and see if the boat will go better. We have to figure out how to make each athlete work to the best of their ability, because you don't have the ability to change the athletes, right? So if you have a fixed number of athletes, that makes it a little bit, that's where you have to start messing around with rigging to see if you can optimize what's going on. Yeah.
So I bet you a few other programs have the same problem, so we have a real mix of heights. And
Yeah.
it seems like the smaller kids have to over-compress.
Yeah.
And taller kids, you can't get them to go too much shorter, and you may not want to. So I would like to know what would be a good strategy so that the shorter kids don't have to over-compress.
Right.
To maintain body angles and just timing with everyone else.
Right. I've kind of messed around. I can only tell you, maybe some of you guys also here have a little bit. We're going to watch this video in a second. But I've sometimes had it where I've had a gal who's considerably shorter, 5 foot, 5'1" ish. And sometimes if the athlete is strong enough and they're pretty fit, I'll make that athlete have a special oar, and I'll put a little smiley face on it and say, you always use the smiley face oar. And essentially what I would do with that oar is I would actually either shorten the inboard, or I'd add 1 centimeter to the length of the oar and shorten the inboard by a little bit, so that the timing of the blade in and blade out, right, it was a little bit harder for her to actually match the timing. So in other words, I just increased the load on the athlete.
So they would have to pull a little harder.
A little bit, yeah. Or at least, because I've noticed what happens is, especially with the taller athletes, in the opposite scenario where you have the really tall person, I noticed that the taller folks sometimes will just short the stroke, because if they're not strong enough, if you have a really tall athlete, and most of them are sort of the same size, it takes that athlete, they either have to be that much stronger to cover the extra 6 or 7 inches of length of their own body, or if they're not strong enough to do that, then they're coming out of the water later than everybody else. And as they come out of the water later, then they have to rush that much faster to get to the catch, right? So they tend to create check and rush the boat, or they dump really early and they're only rowing like 3/4 of that. So in the case of the much taller athlete, I would give them a special oar too with a smiley face, and it would just be the opposite. It would be like it's 2 centimeters shorter, and the inboard might be a 0.5 centimeter or 1 centimeter longer. So I give them more leverage than all the other kids, and it seems to make it much, much better as long as you're matching the blades in and sort of getting it close to blades out, that they don't have this like overwhelming sense of like, holy crap, I have to rush to get back up to the next catch, right? Or the opposite with the smaller person, where they feel like they're like, I am slowing my slide, right?
Yeah.
They're trying to stay real slow and real controlled, but a lot of times, especially with the less skilled kids, it's almost like they don't know that I'm messing around with some of that stuff. I just kind of do it behind the scenes, and I just say, just use the oar with the smiley face. And as long as I'm videotaping and capturing that sort of difference, it seems to work okay. But that's just one way I've done it. Yeah. Yeah, if anyone else has great ideas too, just
I
throw
don't
them
have
out.
a great idea.
Yeah.
Did Mike make any comments about blade shape selection for your crew?
He didn't.
the effective
Not
blading?
not in that presentation. We didn't really get into the shape of the blade. I know that that's a huge factor. I mean, obviously, the Fat 2 and a smoothie, right, I don't even know what the square centimeter difference is, but it's pretty significant, right? I think the other thing we didn't talk about either was the shaft. Now everyone's starting to get into different ways, and sort of the shafts can be soft, they can be stiff. Has a very different way of sort of rowing. So yeah.
So there's a little bit to that, which is obviously the younger, less strong athletes, the softer shaft works for them a little bit better.
Yeah.
They can load it a little easier, and when it hits perpendicular, it's still unspringy, so to say. Bigger athletes prefer a firm shaft,
Yeah.
or as firm as possible, which usually means higher modulus carbon, right? Because carbon comes in 3 moduluses, low, medium, and high.
Right.
So for the gargantuan types, they want, something as the national team level is
Yeah.
stiff as it can be, because they still load the blade up, they still bend the blade,
Yeah.
or the shaft.
Yeah.
I don't know how much, I think people have driven themselves crazy with
Right.
the width of the blades. I mean, if you go all the way back to Peter Johnson, when he was a lightweight rowing here, in the 60s, he had Alfreds.
Right.
And for Halings, and he beat hell out of everybody.
Yeah.
So,
Beast.
and he at 5'8". So, I think it's, can they get the blade in and can they get it out?
Right.
And I think also it depends on, particularly at the high school level, you have such a, junior level, you have such a
Right. The
difference.
variation.
The bandwidth is huge.
Yeah. That's the harder part. That's why some of this stuff is a little bit
I
challenging.
think for programs, it's pick something,
Mm-hmm.
stick with it.
Stick with it. Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
well, I don't think the modulus makes a difference in in that, I mean, it's how the shafts are laid up, or especially like Bracas. You know, you might have 4 layers in one section of the shaft and 2 in another, and they're designed to store and release energy. And you can say, I want one that's very flexible, where you can dial in the center balance. And I think it's the same with Dreher's, when we use high modulus carbon. You can get all those options.
Yeah, I mean, we use almost, because we're so close to here, we use probably 75% of our work a year. So we can specify, and generally we're sort of Goldilocks. We try to be somewhere in the middle. Just because we have such a,
Cool.
you know.
Huh? Yeah, that's cool. Yeah, so in speaking about some of the differences in the heights and stuff like that, let's do a little experiment. If you guys could do me a favor, and if you could sit at the edge of your chair, right? Sort of slide your chair back just a little bit, just sort of sit at the edge of your chair. This is kind of cool because you're all sort of like, okay, so now that you're sitting feet flat, yep, sort of sitting at the edge of the chair, I want you, so everyone can look at the person next to them and just sort of take a look at how high or tall the people are that you're sitting sort of next to, if you will. So we're just taking a look, shoulder height, head height kind of thing. Okay, all right, cool. So now that we kind of, I mean, it looks pretty similar, right? Not that much different, right? Okay, so now can I have everybody just sort of stand up? Okay, now do we notice a difference in a lot of the different heights, right? That we sort of
I was gonna say my torso is like deceptively long.
Yeah, yeah, cool. Okay, you can sit back down. That was good. So right, so the point of that is just to sort of say, like, okay, for the most part, like you may have 2 athletes that are 5'8", and both, you know, the same overall height, but the way in which that 5'8" is assembled is very, very different. And of course, since rowing is a whole bunch of levers, right? We're all just a bunch of lever arms. Like it has a pretty dramatic effect on sort of like what, you know, what we can actually do in the boat. Okay, but let me just take a look. I'm going to show this to you. This is a guy named Tom Purvis. He's developed this cool little apparatus that I think is really, really neat. And it's amazing how much when I see this, how many people have teach some of your athletes sort of like weightlifting in the okay, this will be really cool because oftentimes when we try to teach even something as a basic squat, we know in our mind what it's supposed to look like, so we want all of our athletes to just do that, and we don't understand why some athletes can do squats so beautifully and nicely and other athletes just can't do them at all. And this is a really, really great little sort of video for that.
All right. Here are some often unrecognized factors in squatting that change dramatically or vary from person to person and can totally change how you have someone squat. So the first factor that often goes unrecognized, as simple as it is this line of force. Now we've got a piece of metal here, but that would be the same thing as if you had a big weight up here on your shoulders, and that center of mass must stay over your feet. So that's why right now you can see it's virtually balanced through the body, just like if you were at the top of a squat, and it's somewhere mid-footish because you're not too far up towards the toes and too far towards the heels. Around that line is where everything occurs, everything. And the 2 main things I need you to see right away are the knee goes forward and the butt goes back. And as the knee goes forward, there's this thing called a moment arm that's created. The further forward this knee goes, the greater this amount of weight influences the knee and knee muscles. So 100 pounds times this 4 inches is twice the load on the knee as 100 pounds on your back times this 2 inches. That change right there, double the load on your knee and your knee muscles. The same thing is true back here in this moment arm. Now it's pretty typical with hips and hip muscles being typically more tolerant of load than the knee that we typically have a greater moment arm distribution to the hip muscles and the knee muscles. This is not a bad way to squat right here, where this moment arm is twice as long as this moment arm because you're putting an awful lot of that on these really strong glutes and hip joint and all that stuff. Here's the thing though, with everybody being built differently, not only can it change those proportions some, but it can change your ability to squat in general. Here's the first thing. There are 2 things that can manipulate how far forward your knee can go. And if I didn't say it before, the knee and hip have a forward-backwards give and take relationship. You probably saw that when I brought this knee back to show you moment arm, the hip went back. If the knee goes forward, the hip doesn't have to go back as far. So take a look. If you have limited dorsiflexion, here you are. That's as far as your tibia can lean forward, then that's going to totally influence how far back your butt has to go. So right there, Dorsiflexion. Keep in mind that your dorsiflexion could be limited by tight stuff. It could be limited by weak stuff, creating the tight stuff. It could be limited by structure inside of you without anything you can do about that, called like a bone spur in your ankle. So don't go around thinking you stretch everything and fix everything. Second thing that affects how far forward your knee goes is this length that we could call tibia, but it'd be more accurate to call it floor to knee. Because anything under your heel affects that height or the length of this segment. And as you notice, if I lift the heel, it travels forward. As it travels forward, the butt comes forward. So along with that heel of your shoe, how much rise is in your shoe, there are also structural variances amongst people. The segmental proportions, where someone could, in proportion to their femur, have a really short tibia, or in proportion to their femur, have a really long tibia, which will influence things very differently. So right now, let's take a look. If I put a very short tibia on this person, you're going to notice that their ability to squat down starts to look like he's leaning really far forward. If this person's tibia was longer, they're just collapsing more. They're not necessarily leaning forward more, and that's going to totally change how it feels on their low back. And they might be going, oh, squats are all in your low back. Yeah, especially when you're built this way. And someone who's built differently, they will feel entirely different. And they'll say, no, squats are always in the quads. Why don't you understand this? They don't get that the proportions are critical to this assumption and sensation. So what happens if you're one of these people, and I'm going to exaggerate it, I'm not saying there's anybody exactly like this, but what if your femur was ridiculously long compared to this segment right here? You are never going to be able to squat all the way down. You're never going to be able to fold all the way up, ever. In order to get any lower than this, you're probably going to feel like you're falling. Most people with proportions that lean this direction will often say, I can't go any lower. Yet if you check their knee flexion, they have more than that. If you check their hip flexion, they have more than this. But their proportions do not allow them to go any further, otherwise they will fall down. If their trunk is short, it makes it even worse. If someone's trunk was so short that they had to put the weight roughly right here, they are bent forward and all they feel is low back and all they feel is hip. If, by contrast, you had someone with proportionally shorter femur, proportionally longer floor to knee, and proportionally longer torso in terms of where they can put the weight, this person can fold up, sit all the way down, and they have no idea why anybody thinks squatting is difficult. This person feels quads more than anything else. Halfway down looks like this to them. This is not getting fatigued because it's not all perpendicular to the ground. Totally different thing. So look again at the extremes. Here is an optimum squatting proportion. And of course, if you don't have any dorsiflexion, it still messes with you. So all of these factors are interdependent. But if I were to have a short trunk or put the bar really low, and a proportionally long femur, and a proportionally short tibia, this person hates squats.
And that's typically a rower. Long femur.
Brilliant.
Isn't that wild?
Demonstration.
Yeah. I found that a year or so ago, and I was like, wow.
Breakfast better with Jones.
I have a question about that. So
yeah.
I know he's referring to squatting. I would imagine typically is you talking about motion in general, whether it be with loaded weight wise or not. Is it back squat versus front squat? And so I was curious if obviously our bodies are built very differently, and those are two different squats. So I was curious.
The point is that when you think about the difference between you and Ariel, you're thinking about the sort of anatomical differences that make something for some people fairly easy, like maybe the rowing stroke for someone who's built a certain way is just phenomenally easy, and then another person who I often find that sometimes I find it difficult to work with athletes that have a much longer torso because of the fact that if there's a huge amount of length between their hip and their shoulder, that means that the arc is, the sort of horizontal arc is going to be really vertical, right? So even their body swing as a result of having this much longer lever here is pretty big. So it's just the idea is to sort of imagine that, right?
Yeah, and if you think you versus Ariel, I imagine since Ariel's shorter, more coxswain size, you're more rower, so maybe we generally think rowers might have longer legs, or sort of running into some of these extremes that he's talking about.
Right.
With the front squat in general, the weight is here, and because it's in front of you, it allows you to be.
Go
Okay.
It allows you to be more upright in your squat,
Mm-hmm.
because it's sort of like the weight is almost like a counterbalance.
Yeah.
So you're able to be more upright, and with shorter limb lengths, longer limb lengths here, and sort of that counterbalance, it might be easier to sort of have it here be more upright, less load on the lower back. If the proportions here sort of work out, like, oh, like, yeah, front squats aren't that bad, sort of more vertical, there's less of that hinge versus, you know, when you're here with, you know, the longer limbs and the weight being on your back, you have to really be able to control it, and, you know, for the rowers, it might put more load on the lower back, depending on their...
That's part of my thought process, is that we put a lot of strain on rowers' backs all the time, so if we can teach them the front squat, they're not gonna necessarily be lifting as heavy a weight, but I think they'll get the same muscular benefits from it with a little bit more of like protection to their back, while still getting them that strength benefits. But then Ariel felt that personally for her, that she always feels more pain in her back when she does front squats. So she prefers back squats, and so that I think has led to her to prefer back squats with her athletes. But I was just curious if it was because of our body sizes that's why our preference was the way it was, or if there was other factors that kind of went into that. If you have any input on that.
I'd say maybe like a little bit of both. I know that in general, front squat is more anterior, so it is going to be relying more the quads, sort of like your forefoot, versus back squat. It's easier to sort of stay in the heels, and it becomes a more posterior chain required squat. And so how you're built, your proportions, your size may come into play with what you favor.
Don't you think front would be safer in general, or like goblet squats?
Yeah,
I mean, whenever I'm injured, they're like, do goblet squats, and I'm like,
yeah. So the nice thing about, you know, anytime we're teaching squats or correcting form, anytime you can do a goblet squat where you're holding the weight in front of you, it gives you a little bit of play, and you could either sort of adjust yourself slightly to sort of find your balance, move the weight out, probably to counterbalance yourself a little more, so it's less of a torque or moment arm like he was talking about on either your lower back or your knees, and sort of like there's a way to play around with it there. Little bit safer, but obviously, you know, at some point you can only pick up so much in your hands here. So it depends on what you're lifting, but
Yeah. The different segment. Oh, go ahead.
I'm going to be disruptive.
Sure.
Please do.
And my background was a dozen years at Mike Boyle's gym. Mike Boyle is known.
We're digressing a little, but that's cool.
But
let's do that.
He hasn't done a back squat in 2 decades. Doesn't believe in them.
Right.
But if your athlete has enough flexibility here with the front squat, that helps. However, with the athletes that I coach, we don't use barbells at all. We use a kettlebell on an inverted BOSU ball. The knee never goes over the foot, because once your knee starts to approach your toes, you're getting shear in your knee. Yeah. And these athletes they'll start out getting to parallel to the floor. After a week, and again, these are exceedingly talented people, they'll get butt to heels. And the trick is keeping the kettlebell right close to the center of gravity. Also, they don't damage their lumbar spine. I was coaching a young woman at Riverside this afternoon, 6'2", so definite rower's build. She did a front squat, but she really protected her lumbar spine. If you watch a number of athletes, they'll start to get a curve like this in their lumbar spine. Just the cumulative effect of that is terrible. So it's a totally different philosophy, and holding even a 24K kettlebell is plenty of weight when you're getting down butt to heels. And again, and we believe in the high rep, low weight method. Instead of doing some huge weight for 6 reps, we'll go for 20 reps with the lighter weight, and that goes into a whole another discussion. But in terms of the squat, it's a very controversial exercise.
Yeah. So what I got out of that whole video is that maybe body angles, especially when you have people with different lever lengths, getting people to match body angles may not be such a good thing.
Yeah. and there's going to be, actually, let me fast forward to it. Let's see if
Actually, and I'm gonna just add one thing.
Yeah.
In our group, we have people
Oh, I know.
from Cox and size 5'4" to one guy's 6'9", and they can all get that deep squat,
Similar.
and not have their shoulders over their toes by any means.
Yeah, I do think that's kind of like where that, the idea that, because so what's actually like stylistic, right? That sort of gets into the idea of like, you know, what, in terms of having all those athletes have to be at the same, you know, it's the same thing when you see an athlete that has a very curved spine to some degree, if that's natural. Let's say that athlete was someone who did a lot of breaststroke. Like we have one girl on the passing, you see, we have one girl on the team who's a really great swimmer, and she spent like her whole childhood doing this, and of course her body is like essentially shaped like that. And so we've like said, hey, listen, like we need you to try to sit up a little bit taller, and she's gotten a lot better over the last year or so, but still, there's no way that person is going to ever sort of have like, let's say another person on the team was a gymnast, and so she spent the whole time, you know, in her life like this, like those two body types, right? There's not going to be a way where we're going to have that sort of same body angle per se. It's gonna, you know, maybe you'll get the same length, the same catch length, but they'll have to accept the fact that they're going to look a lot different, right? Which makes a lot of sense. But I think that's kind of why we would want to try to think about these things, because I think so much we want to have all 8 athletes in a boat like look exactly the same, or you know, like obviously the movement of trying to move exactly the same is very important, but you're going to have all those different body types that are trying to achieve that.
Do you teach this C-back style or straight back or something in between?
I mean, when I just kind of make sure that girls are not slumping. Ethan Curran has this beautiful thing where he says the idea would be that when you're here and you're in the stroke, that you're trying not to sit on the pockets of your jeans, right? So like if I end up sort of allowing my pelvis to just sort of soften up to the point where I'm collapsing and I'm sitting on my pockets, that's not really a great spot, right? I can even feel right now if I tried to stand up, right? Like I would have to sort of do this in order for me to stand up, as opposed to, right?
I think it was 2 issues ago, and I think it was an article in the rowing magazine about, and this, I think she was an Irish national team, and she's now FISA, and I think the article came out just recently. They've done a long study on back issues, especially lower back issues in rowing. And I thought they said that its indication is that somewhat of a C-back is more protective than a straight back. And this article is out. I got to remind myself to go look at it.
It's on the FISA one?
I believe it's FISA, yes.
Okay, cool. Because what I was thinking about in that particular thing is that the difference between the lumbar section and then you have your thoracic, and then you have your cervical, and like I guess what I was sort of thinking is that as long as this doesn't really move, like as long as this and this sort of stay together as one unit, that would be back sparing. It's only when you end up sort of rotating your pelvis forward, right, to here or something like that, and then the lumbar is even like they just sort of disconnect there. That's probably not so cool, right? When you have that sort of like when those 2 areas of your bodies and the muscles are sort of allowing that sort of to move around, that's probably when, because I know sometimes, I mean, and it goes back to everyone having a slightly different, shape as well, But
There's a lot of work on, there's a Stuart McMillan, Dr. McMillan, who's a spine doctor who works with the Canadian national team. And he's verbose, but his podcasts are brilliant. And really discuss that entire issue.
Okay. Cool. Okay, we'll go back to just real quick. I know we're running out of time for sure. So here's 2 different catches, and this again goes, you have this sort of thing that's happening right here. Got this beautiful flexibility. Obviously, she's very compressed. There's no gap between her thigh and her chest. And then you have a slightly different sort of thing sort of going on over here. And so, by the way, this is Connie Draper. So I just pulled a couple of the slides out of here so that when we talk about the way the boat can be rigged, that this rigging, a person can achieve this position. The rigging, you may have to actually have a significantly different rig for a person who rows like this, right? But that was one thing. Then the other part of that was the finish positions, again, we were talking about sitting on your pockets. This is kind of a good example of a poor finish where a person is sort of like leaning back very, very far and they're kind of sitting on their pockets as opposed to there, right? And the reason why I sort of showed that was because the rig that you could use would be, like I said, if the person was consistently finishing like this, then you would actually be able to have, like, let's say, for example, you wouldn't have to change pitch, let's say, for example, right? So certain things that you can do where you could actually have more or less. Let me, let's see, so we did that one. I guess what we can do is sort of think about the scenarios that I had. So you guys want to watch one more of Purser's videos?
Sure.
Yeah, let's see what he's got here. Let's go to this. I think he's got. I would encourage you guys to go. We'll go to drive time. This is another thing that he measures.
Hello again, Mike Purser here, and today we will have another look at evaluating your crew's rigging. This video will discuss drive time and how we measure it. Drive time is a measurement of the time the blades are in the drive phase of the stroke, beginning at the catch when the blades are fully buried, ending at the release when the blades are extracted from the water and reach the feathered position. Drive time is partially controlled by the athlete's stroke arc length as seen on this graphic. Arc length is the result of the athlete's work distance and the rigging dimensions of inboard, outboard, and spread. Another factor of drive time is the rigging load. Here is a graphic of the rigging dimensions that affect the rigging load. A heavier load and longer stroke arc length will increase the drive time, and the reverse is true. With experience, coaches can get a rough measurement of drive time with their stopwatch. However, a much more accurate way is to use video. You must use a video playback software with a timer that displays time in hundredths or thousandths of a second. Here we see a video timer in the lower right corner of the frame. Similar to measuring blade slip, drive time should be measured with the crew rowing at race rate and race intensity to best evaluate rigging efficiency. To measure drive time, we need to identify the frame time at the catch and then the finish. Using stop action, we can move the video frame by frame to identify the frame time when the blade is fully buried at the catch. Here, we identify the catch at 3.503 seconds. Once the time has been recorded, we forward the video to identify the time the blade reaches the feathered position. Again, we can move the video frame by frame to identify the feather time. And here, we see the time as 4.104 seconds. Large crews with multiple blades that do not have perfect timing can be challenging to identify the correct frame. The best idea is to find the average. Finally, with the catch and finish times identified, we can calculate the drive time by subtracting the catch time from the feather time. Here, we see that the crew has a drive time of 0.60 seconds. Effective rigging is a balance of drive time and blade slip, getting maximum acceleration and boat movement in the least amount of drive time. With this information, coaches can adjust the rigging length and or load to allow the crew to row with a higher or lower stroke rate and stroke ratio. If you thought this video was useful, please like it below and visit my Rowing Perseverance Facebook page for more coaching development tips.
So I
Hello
guess
again.
you'd have to make sure that you're obviously doing that at your race cadence, right? Which would be important. And I suppose if you identified that your drive time was slow, slower than like whatever the, I guess if you, I don't know how you would measure it. There is a general rule for that or not a rule for that, but drive time is what? 0.7? Don't know.
I was watching, I went to Casey Fuller.
Oh yeah, you went, yep.
Fuller, but Casey down in Sarasota, he's a coach down in Sarasota. Galvin, he's Galvin.
Yep.
He did a whole thing last weekend in Saratoga for the junior coach conference on basically rhythm and drive time, and like he knows based on drive time what rhythm he's looking for. So it's usually, I think he said something along the lines of like 0.62 is, or I might be misrecalling, but I think, yeah, somewhere in that 0.6, 0.7 range is like drive time you're looking for, and like whatever the rhythm you like is, whatever kind of sort of drive rhythm, the legs, body, arms, whether it's sequential or sort of, you talked about either a toss or a throw.
Oh, yeah.
Or is it toss?
That's kind of what Chris was talking about too.
Yeah. Or sorry, toss or a jump type of stroke. You can kind of that might change the drive time, and so then you sort of adjust and however you rig your boat and you train your athletes like to apply the power through the drive will affect the rhythm that you come out with.
Yeah, for
and
sure.
what it looks like.
What do you think? Go ahead.
The numbers don't matter at all.
They don't matter at all. Okay.
They don't matter at all. You cannot, because it depends on how you're measuring.
I see.
So as long as you're consistent, you can measure it however you like.
But you can't compare. Yeah.
But you should not compare from KC to BC to anybody else. And you can do this on the water with a stopwatch.
Right.
Because whatever as long as you're fairly consistent.
Right. With the method that you use to do it.
Because blades go in, and I measure when I think the blade is done, but not when it's feathered.
Yeah, right.
So I don't know why he went to the feather.
That's what I thought too. I thought that was rather odd.
The drive time is to there.
That's right, yeah, when the
You're
blade is no longer driving the boat.
You're doing some other stuff.
I know, there was another example of
Which
that.
takes time.
Yeah.
So, I mean, you're working with a set amount of time per stroke rate. So then you have to decide, and you can, by the way, measure drive time at any stroke rate.
Okay.
And you should, over time, if you collect enough of your crew's data, it'll be in a fairly narrow range. And you'll find that driving at 0.75, the way I measure it, at 24 is pretty good. But if we're trying to drive at 0.75 at 36, our ratio is all screwed up.
Oh, wow, right.
We need to drive at 0.6 or so at 36. So that's what I'm looking for when I'm evaluating the rig.
Right,
Or the crew in the rig.
Right.
Strength helps.
Yeah.
Good rowing helps.
Yeah.
So, and
Yeah,
consistency.
quick flip, yeah.
Well, you mentioned consistency.
Yeah.
If you don't have any consistency,
I know.
you can only get kind of a statistical average, and that's not really going to inform your crew very much. But the key is, don't take anybody else's measurements, and you don't need dartfish. You can do it right on. You can do it visually.
Wow.
You can. I call it out to the crew sometimes.
Wow.
And then the big gotcha is they'll improve the drive time by rowing shorter.
Ah, yeah.
The blade will go in later.
Yeah.
So the blade will go in like this instead of going in.
Yes.
So now they're rowing
'Cause
about 75% length.
Got it.
But the drive time is there.
Oh,
And they're really feeling pretty good.
Yeah.
So you have to, that's the only
Be
cut.
careful. Yeah, right.
You have to consistently row in the way that you want them to row.
Yeah.
And be honest about it. And then the drive time sets up a lot of rhythm characteristics, not only ratio characteristics, but if he was actually talking about rhythm as opposed to ratio,
Yeah,
then you could look for different, because you're forced to do things in a different way if you don't have enough time.
Right.
So one of the things that we're always looking at in terms of, well, we need to go this fast at the end of the season, we need to be able to race at this kind of rate. And in order to have any kind of comfort, we need to be able to drive the boat in this amount of time. And there's a range from, it's around 0.6 to 0.65 when we're really cooking.
Right. Wow.
I did this with the Dutch national women's team and the Olympics where they came roaring through Romania, I think. The whole last quarter, they were like 2 seconds faster for the last 5.
Wow.
and they were rowing at 40 with 2-to-1 ratio.
Wow.
Oh,
They were driving in 0.5
Wow.
from entry to where I thought exit was, watching video.
Hmm.
So,
That's amazing.
yeah, that's amazing.
But they had to be technically very proficient, it wasn't just power.
Yeah, you're rowing at 40, you can't, you
Yeah.
could row at 40 and be pretty awful.
Can't make
Which would be
mistakes, yeah.
crashing and not much speed.
Yeah.
We've seen crews like that, but this was really efficient. I mean,
Wow.
2 seconds faster
Yeah.
than everybody else.
That's amazing.
I have a question for the coaches.
Yeah, yeah.
Does any of them have the Nielsen Kellerman Orlock?
And does that measure things like drive time
No,
and slippage and all that?
it measures a lot of stuff.
Okay.
Um,
I've never used one. I don't know. But-
Well, it's an interesting system,
Mhm.
but it relies on the oarswomen.
Okay.
They have to actually punch the dial sometimes and they forget.
Well, this is my next question then.
Oh, wow.
But
I mean-
they're developing, they're going away from
Mm.
the speed coaches
Mhm.
to simpler readers at each system, at each
Oh,
oarlock.
station, yeah, wow.
And then the oarlocks are gonna be a little bit less dependent on the oarswomen to actually turn them on and
Oh, I
off.
see.
And if you're recording like a piece or something,
Mhm.
they have to actually start and stop the
Oh,
oarlock.
wow.
Well, so this is my next question is,
I mean,
Like a
the speed
GoPro.
coach.
Yeah, right.
Speed,
It-
the
it-
oarlock's always working, it's the
Yeah.
speed coach.
it would seem to me, okay, so if these things measure power, correct?
Yeah,
So it would seem to me, I mean, you can put someone in erg and see how well their erg is, and you can seat race them and all that, but there's that individual that seems to come out strong in a race. They don't get a adrenaline drop and all that. I mean, they just it's nice and relaxed and smooth. That this device, you could see who under actual racing conditions, who's pulling, and who are the best pullers.
Yep.
So-
Yeah, the oarlocks, you can see all that. They've chosen to reduce the amount of data that you can actually see.
Yeah.
So they will have full range, so catch angle, release angle, so whatever that oarlock swings to. But they have this arbitrary, what is it, 200 newtons, is that right? 20K or whatever it is, as a threshold. And from when the oarlock goes into that point is called the slip.
So it measures slip then.
And it also measures wash, which I found was much more useful. The women usually cut out around the pin, and then they float from the pin to the release.
Mm.
So they're washing for like 30 degrees. There's nothing going on.
All right.
But you can see that too.
My final question then is so I mean I tell and that seems to me works with a lot of the boys is try to row even splits during your piece. Don't fly and die.
Right.
Can you do the same thing with the oarlock? Just say, okay, this is your target. This is what I want for splits throughout the entire race. No flying and dying, consistent speed type of thing.
The speed coaches have little graphs on them,
Right.
and you can choose to see, because it's a speed coach, right? now,
Right.
You can see what the boat speed is, you can see what your rating is, and you can also see what the power curves look like, what the force curves look like.
Right.
So and we've had peach systems in the men's boats where guys could afterwards, they couldn't see it live, but they could see their force curves, and they would actually change the way they rode to change their force curves.
Well, one of their
And you can do
promotional
this-
videos.
Yeah, you can do this with the NK.
They take 4 rowers of different heights and different abilities, and they have them look at the curves. And after about 10-15 minutes, they're rowing together. I mean, that would sell me if we could ever afford those things. It seems to me it's almost better as a novice tool, but
So,
Yeah.
So-
Go ahead. Yep.
but I don't.
if you go all the way back to the granddaddy before Kleshnev, but if you say Kleshnev's to start and string gauging and measurement for force, you then run into Peach, who was an F1 guy, and he developed the force curves for rowing, which Coach is quite correct about. can't see in the boat. If you're in an erg, not an erg, but if you're in a tank, you can put it up on a screen. You then can look at another guy in Colorado doing smart oar, and that is all force measurement, but it's a transducer inside the oar that's connected to, wired to the oar lock. So right now, you then go to NK, which is more, again, another force measurement, and then there's QUISC, which is measuring potential, which is different. One man's potential is another man's force. They essentially get you to the same spot, which is what you've seen described. Athletes can look at their curves and theoretically, and this is where there's some divergence that I've researched, the theory is, well, I can coach myself. I can row in Long Beach and I can row in Sarasota, I can row here, and I can send all this information to the coaches. And now I can see, as a coach, I've got 8 athletes. Well, here are the 4 that row the most similar to one another. And if you guys all want to get the 8 to row together, you say, well, this is either the potential curve, it doesn't really matter if it's the potential curve or the force curve, to my mind, as long as they're rowing together. We use the quiz system on ergs, on concept 2 statics. And it was enlightening. And we also helped one of our athletes who's at Bucknell as a freshman this year find 5 seconds in her erg, because the document, the feedback that we were getting showed us, like, wow, there's this thing that our eyes hadn't picked up. So the problem with it all is everybody's sort of arguing about, is it force, is it potential? How do we have time to really scale up? How do we have time to put it on the oars? How do we have time to then read that data? So talk to the guys at German national team. They're measured twice a year with a very sophisticated proprietary system, probably pretty close to Peach, but they're not talking. And they don't let their athletes ever see it.
Oh, wow.
We know what you did, Dita. You don't need to know. And so that's right. So, but the point is, if you can find, you know, whether we haven't used the NK system because it's kind of expensive. You know, QUISC is like $250 a pod, and now that it's gone to the iOS operating system, every kid's got a smartphone, not a smartphone, but an Apple. They just download the application.
Well, the Dreers sell a phone with it, I saw, but
yeah.
I listened to her lectures, and she was also emphasizing you put the sensor in the seat that you want a certain seat slide speed that she was saying is
Who's she?
The woman that developed the system.
Oh, Christina.
Yeah.
Borkness, yeah. Yeah, I know. I mean, you can put them. I mean, I have it on my single. I have it on the seat and on the oars, but basically you have to switch from port, starboard, or seat. The new iOS will make it a lot simpler. If you want to just get data in terms of a curve on athletes, the simplest thing is a C2 or an RP, and just put it on the seat, take the data from the recording on the phone. It's an accelerometer, which is in the phone.
Right.
And that'll give you it's a baseline. I think the thing is everybody gets dazzled by the technology. Yeah. And it can get away from you from the idea of simply saying, right, okay, this person rows really differently than this one. How different is that in terms of their real physical output capability and technical excellence?
Yeah. Well, so does it make, so you mentioned that the Germans don't want any feedback, but it seems to me.
The athletes do, the coaches will.
But if they can, well, and you know, kind of, but if it will help them be better rowers,
yep.
I absolutely want them to see it.
Absolutely.
Would you say that?
We do. We let our athletes see the curve.
That's cool. The NK system is developed, so they have the new GPS Cox box, which is going to be released next month, right?
Yeah, that's what they said at Joy.
Presumably.
Right.
And they're going from the speed coaches to a different kind of display. That display will have a wire down to a trunk wire down the length of the boat, which goes to the speed coach. Sorry, the coxswain.
Yeah, the one, right.
Then the coxswain can actually look at the power outputs from each of the oar locks. But more importantly, they don't need 8 phones anymore. They need one phone at the Cox box to do NK link out to the coach. So if you're driving along in your boat, you will be able to read all those different oar locks in real time.
And not crash into anybody.
Or if you wanted to, you could sit in your office on a rainy day and send your crew out and watch them row. Put a camera on the boat, and maybe they have a radio now, so
Yeah. Well,
you don't have to leave the building.
great. Yeah.
In terms
Wally.
of teaching really novice people, I found just sitting on concept 2 erg and looking at the force curve and teaching people, show me 20 strokes at a whatever. Okay, now move where your force curve is. Like go wonder if it's, if it goes up and it peaks over here, make it move. So get the athlete to figure out, how can I shift that? What do I have to do to make that curve do, and then be consistent for 20 more strokes to make it do that. And that idea of changing that can translate, it gives them something to work with. Don't matter what it is, the whole idea is to change it.
I love that idea.
And I got that from Craftsbury.
I think it's a great idea.
But it works great like on a rainy day where, we gotta be inside. We're gonna sit down, this isn't gonna be an erg workout, this is gonna be, how do I do it, what do I do, okay, let's see if you can match this person, because this person has this shape force curve, and all you need to do is figure out what is it I need to do to make it look like that.
And that's
And that's like low tech.
Yeah, I like.
Okay. Yeah. I guess what we'll do, does anyone have any other, you guys, we sort of totally digress on some
Sorry.
cool stuff. That's good.
That's great.
It's kind of actually, it's kind of
Everyone
one
has
of the
helped me
reasons
along.
why we get together and do coaching stuff like this. I remember back in the old days when Ethan was here, we used to just get together for pizza and beer all the time and just have random conversations about all of this stuff, which is kind of really neat. I would definitely encourage you guys to take a look at Mike's stuff. His Facebook page link is on there. Certainly his website is there. And I found, in just watching some of those videos, it sort of helps turn my brain a little bit on, oh wow, when I did see an athlete sort of doing this, this is what might have been happening, and so I can potentially move a foot plate, or I can lower heel stops, or I can sort of think about it in a way where I can, especially with the outlying sort of kids that are really big and really small. Those are some of the things, right? So, that's kind of what I would say. Does anyone have any other questions about just the scenario stuff? No, because I know your girls get a chance to move stuff around.
They move things around, but I'm not quite sure if they know
What they're doing.
often. And
Understood,
I think we might need to have a little education session, because they all get in the boat and take 20 minutes moving their feet and wasting practice time.
Right.
Is part of it too.
Right.
But I think we need to go over why they're moving their feet.
Yeah, that's good. That's true too. The novice kids do that all the time too. They say, or they say no, I have to have 4 spacers. I always have 4 spacers. Right. Even if it's a different boat, they're in a 4, they're in an 8, or they don't even know. Right. So it's kind of a.
And I find with the Masters women, we launch in the dark, and they spend forever clogging up the bridge as they completely disassemble the entire
Right. Oh, I lost the wing nut. Yeah. Right. Yeah.
Whereas I don't know what their knowledge level is on what they're trying to set.
Exactly. Yeah.
One of the great things of the NK system, the power locks, is that you can't change the speed.
Change the height. Yeah, it is what it is.
It's locked in.
Right. That's good.
Till the next time.
That's right. Cool.
I misspoke, it's Stuart McGill.
Oh, Stuart McGill, of course.
Sam caught it.
Yeah, Stuart McGill.
Sam.
Dr. McGill is quite an extraordinary dude. He's definitely, he's got his website is his Backfit Pro, but he's got all of his articles and his white papers and stuff on there, which is really great.
And he's also on Leo training for people who listen.
Oh, cool. All right, I didn't know that.
But
Yeah,
he
is.
works with the Canadian national team and
Yeah.
mixed martial artists. I don't quite get that one.
I saw him in person actually like a long time ago in Hartford. Yeah,
He's
it's quite
amazing.
something. So yeah, if you guys want information on back strength or learning how to manage back pain, things like that, like he is by far like the super person, the person that I would always like send articles to some of our PTs and say, make sure when you go see your physical therapist that you bring this article with you and you guys talk about it together, right?
That risks and forums, those are the big complaints of the kids.
Yeah.
And he's the guy, and some of you have heard this from me in the weight room, he likens your spine to a credit card. And what happens when you do this too much?
Snap. Yeah.
So I bet you he's an upright guy then.
Again,
Check him out though.
Lumbar,
Yeah, absolutely.
lumbar spine, basically,
check it out.
what you wanna have is your lumbar spine pulled toward your navel when you're up at the front end.
Braced, yeah.
And the same thing when you're doing a squat.
Super stiffness, they call it.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, all right, you guys. Well, I thank you very much.
Thank you.
For contributing and getting here and having part of this community thing come together a little bit. I think it's really neat. And certainly, you can get deeper into it if you want to sort of like check this little book
Does
out.
he still have, I've been trying to buy that book on Amazon, and it's been out of print.
Really?
And they're selling used copies for like $70. So if he's republishing it.
Oh,
that's the Bible.
I guess you have to go to his website.
Healing's one of his books $100.
Yeah, go to his website.
John, I have a photocopy of the entire thing.
Whoa.
I can make you
What's
one.
going on here?
It's from the IRL.
I love it.
Oh, that's right, yeah.
Yeah.
Oh,
It's terrible.
Thanks,
I hate
Jules.
reading it.
yeah.
It's terrible.
I'd rather spend my $100 on something else.
Yeah.
Yeah, no.
It's on my shelf in my living
If you
room.
guys need any of the stuff that you heard about tonight, feel free to reach out
Yeah, I
to
can
us.
just
Like
send you
Bodie
the
can send
yeah.
anyone like the thing you put together. If you go on our coach education blog on the website, I have like the one-page takeaway that he put together for this. This video will be up there, so if you want to like rewatch some of it for reminders of like any of the videos that we watched, it's up there. And yeah, feel free to grab more sloppy joes.
Oh yeah, that's true too.
But yeah, February 20th will be the next one. I'll send out a sign up, and we're hoping to get one of the Harvard assistant coaches to come chat about different types of rowing strokes and stuff like that. So, or creating your ideal stroke. Yeah, should be a lot of fun. But this is great. I had a ton of fun.
Yeah.